I froze the documentary, and the frame stayed on my dad's face walking past a crime scene from almost 20 years ago, like he'd been planted right inside someone else's memory. I called out, "Dad, you need to see this," and my voice sounded small in the living room. He came in, looked at the TV, and his color drained like someone had turned off a light. He ripped family photos from the wall and started shoving them toward the fireplace with a speed I'd never seen. "They aired it," he kept saying, over and over like a chant. I felt a cold clench in my chest and watched as our whole life, the pictures, the smiling faces I'd always known, went into flames. My mother came out of her office with papers in her hands, glanced at the fire, and then ran upstairs like she'd been waiting for one signal her whole life. The house smelled suddenly like burnt perfume and old paper, and my hands shook so badly I couldn't hold the remote. He picked up a pistol from the mantel and told me to get the emergency bag from under my bed like it was the most normal thing in the world. "Hurry," he said, voice low and tight, not looking at me but at the door, as if someone was already halfway down the street. I went to my room and tugged at the quilt, feeling like I was underwater. Under the mattress was a duffel I'd never seen, heavy and familiar in a way that made my stomach drop. Inside were plain clothes, unmarked bills fanned like a secret, and a passport with my photo but a different name, Madison Carter. There were car keys to a Honda with a key fob that wasn't mine, and a new burner phone still in its plastic sleeve. I sat on the bed and stared at that passport like it was a joke I'd missed. "What is this?" I asked, my voice cracking. He said, "We don't have time." He handed me the phone and the passport like passing me a bruise. It felt like the ground had been yanked out from under me and the world I grew up believing in was collapsing into ash. My mother came down the stairs with 3 packed duffels and fury in her eyes like I'd never seen before. She wasn't the PTA mom in that moment. She was someone who got up every morning knowing how to disappear. She grabbed my arm and shook me until I blinked. "You need to go now," she said. "Your friends, your phone, leave it." I told her no, that I wasn't going anywhere until she told me what the hell was happening. She looked at my father, and for an instant they were 2 strangers who'd rehearsed a life together. "We've been in witness protection since you were 6, he said finally, and the words hit me like a punch. "Your name isn't what you think." I laughed, an ugly sound, because we lived in Connecticut, because he sold insurance for the office down the street, because my mom taught piano on Saturdays. He gave a brittle, tired little laugh back. "Cover stories," he said. "The piano lessons were a way to check in." I testified against people who kill for a living. They thought I was dead the night the anal murders happened. I helped put them away. We're exposed now. I remember reaching for logic because I needed something solid to hold. "This is insane," I told him. "You're my dad. You can't." He cut me off, and for the first time I heard how much fear was braided into his voice. Someone at the production left raw footage. They blurred the wrong faces. They made it a breadcrumb trail. The fireplace hissed, photos curled and blackened. He told me the names of places I'd never heard and dates that meant nothing until he tied them to the footage on the screen. He said, "We have to move, Maddie," and my name felt foreign and right at the same time through his lips. My mother shoved a pistol into her purse as if it were a lipstick. I asked, "Will they hurt us? Will they come here?" She said nothing at first then. "They want us. We're the ones they care about." Her hands trembled as she readied a small kit of things I would never have known to pack. A folded copy of our new name papers, a single family photo burned at the edge, a small Bible stained with years of travel. The room smelled of smoke and panic and old secrets, and I thought about the life I'd been building, college plans, a barista job, friends who thought they knew me, and watched it slide into a pile of blackened frames. A voice outside called in a heavy Balkan accent and named me by what they thought I was. "Mason?" It was the shout that turned my stomach into ice. My mother grabbed me and pushed me toward the front door as if she could shove the danger away by speed alone. My father peered through the blinds, counted fingers, 4 down the street, 2 on rooftops, and pointed like a drill sergeant. 10 minutes, he said, eyes sharp. "Get in the car, don't look back." I looked back anyway. The house I'd always been safe in was a burned-in image in my head, a frame on the TV, and now ash on the hearth, and I realized honesty had been traded for survival without my consent. My heart hammered a rhythm I couldn't stop, as we stuffed what we could into duffels, and the old Honda back on the curb seemed like a stranger's ride to a life I hadn't chosen. The house turned into a war room in minutes, like we'd been rehearsing for this without me knowing the lines. My dad sat at the kitchen table and talked fast, laying out the truth in pieces that fit together like a map of how our lives had actually worked. He said the insurance job, the piano lessons, the little routines were all covers to hide us and his past work, laundering money for a violent syndicate until he flipped and put people behind bars. He said the marshals had given us new names and moved us from place to keep us safe. I kept picturing the carpool line and recitals and felt sick because each memory now had an edge to it I'd never noticed. He told me someone had leaked raw footage from a documentary, that faces hadn't been blurred right, and the mob figured out he was alive again. He said a nephew recognized him online, and that was all it took to make us targets. My hands still smelled like smoke, and I listened through that hangover of panic while the house spun around me. My mother, who taught piano and made casseroles, sounded different when she spoke Serbian into the phone, like someone who had been living two languages for decades. She said, "Handlers compromised. Tyson's dead. We're on our own," and the words landed like a verdict. She stuffed extra ammunition into duffels with practiced movements, snapping zippers closed without looking. She wasn't a suburban lady in that moment. She was a shield, hands steady as a machine. It was the kind of calm that had been forged by long practice. She spoke to people I didn't know and arranged backups with voices I didn't understand. I asked what Tyson meant, and my dad's face folded up with meaning I couldn't translate. He told me Tyson had been the one who kept their last safe house and coordinated moves. With him gone, the chain of protection had holes we couldn't pretend weren't there. The doorbell rang, and a new kind of anger cut through the room. My dad peered through the curtains and counted them in clicks, like he'd been doing it his whole life. 4 on the street, 2 on roofs, he said, quiet and precise as a surgeon. The voice outside had a heavy Balkan accent and a calm I hated. He shouted demands and promises. "Burn it down. Come out slowly and we'll make it easy." I felt like my ribcage was a trap being locked. My mother grabbed a Glock from her bag and loaded it like she'd practiced while I was a kid and she was folding laundry. She put the gun in her lap and looked at me like she'd been holding this for years just in case. My dad pushed my shoulder and said, "Get in the car. Now." He shoved me toward the garage with a force that made me stumble but made my legs move.
Sorry for the quick interruption. If you're enjoying this so far, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and leave comment below. It really helps the channel grow. Alright, let's jump back into the story.
We didn't leave by the front door. He opened the garage and forced the old hatch up like a barricade being pulled aside. I climbed into the driver's seat, keys in my hand that I didn't recognize, and my heart was a drumbeat in my throat. He shoved me forward and the engine coughed awake. We didn't creep. He drove like someone who'd done this before, quick and direct, no hesitation. Before we cleared the driveway, a burst of shots answered us. Glass exploded. The sound was a dozen fingers clapping at my ears. The rear window crumpled like tissue paper, and a panel of the back took a bullet hole. My mother fired back from the passenger seat, emptying rounds toward sound without aiming for faces I could see. "Drive!" she yelled. Her voice cut through the chaos like a command and a prayer. We rammed through the hedges and hit the neighbor's yard, knocking over lawn ornaments with a weight and speed you'd only see in a nightmare. Porcelain gnomes spun and broke, water bowls tipped over, and someone's metal flamingo bent like it had been made of paper. The car hit a white picket fence, and it splintered under the tires with a rain of wood and paint. The impact jolted me forward, and my seatbelt burned across my chest. I kept moving because the only alternative felt like standing there and waiting to be counted. Behind me, the house I'd left on fire and ash blurred past like a bad photograph. Each break of glass felt like the past being erased in real time, and every flash from an enemy weapon felt like a message. "We can find you anywhere." Bullets thudded into the trunk and metal shrieked under stress while my dad shouted directions, name after name, places to go. The neighbor's dogs barked and then cut off like somebody turned off a switch. My hands shook, but I kept them on the wheel because that was all I had that still made sense. My father told me to floor it, to hit the culvert under the bridge like it was the only route he trusted, and I obeyed because he'd always been the person with the plan in a crisis. The road ahead narrowed to a tunnel of panic, and the GPS in my head scrambled between the life I'd known and the life they were forcing on me. We were hemorrhaging safety by the second, and the only thing moving us was speed, noise, and a set of keys I had never wanted to hold. We slammed through the fence, and the world narrowed to a single, ugly plan: get out, get down, and don't stop. The car jolted and finally surrendered to mud at the mouth of a drainage tunnel. Water rushed in, cold and black, and I felt it snake up my legs like it wanted to pull me under. My dad hauled open his door and shoved me, Mom, then himself into the river of muck. We ran with the stink of gasoline and wet earth in our noses, flashlights cutting shapes on the tunnel walls and voices shouting names in a language I only half understood. My sneakers slipped. The light from the guns bobbed like lighthouses and then came nearer, and we dove behind a low concrete ledge where the water hit our knees and the cold stole the breath from our lungs. We pressed our backs to the cold concrete, and I could feel the blood hammering in my temples. The searchers, boots, and splashes clanged like a drumbeat above us. One man's flashlight swung close enough that my heart leapt into my throat. I could see the edges of his boot, the frayed cuff of his jeans, a sliver of his face in the light. My mother shoved a wet hand into my shoulder to keep me from breathing loud, and my father's fingers scraped against my knuckles in a grip that meant, silently, stay. We held ourselves like statues while voices barked coordinates and then faded into distance. Time condensed into the span between flashlights and the space where footsteps stopped. In that cold, I felt the full weight of every lie I'd been told. The warmth I'd taken for granted seemed like something from a different life. When the footsteps and voices finally drifted away, it was like someone exhaled and let us exist again. We crawled through the sludge, hands dirty with the history I'd never known, and climbed up into a backyard I didn't recognize. The houses there looked unfamiliar, like someone had cut pieces from another town and pasted them next to one another. My mother wiped her face with the back of her hand, then looked at the car keys with a steadiness that made me forget to be afraid for a second. She turned to the street and said in a low voice, "I'll get the backup. Clothes, papers, everything. Stay put, move only if you hear me." She sounded like a captain leaving for a quick mission, not like my mother who used to remind me to wear a coat. She drove off in a blur, the taillights like two small red comets disappearing between the houses. My dad and I ducked behind a dumpster by a convenience store and tried to blend into the smoke-stained alley. He sat with his back against the metal and watched the pumps and the small strip of road like someone marking points on a map. "They'll check everywhere along our route," he said softly, as if reciting an old lesson. He had this posture then, like someone who could disappear into crowds and reappear in places that made sense only to him. I watched his eyes flick from one direction to another, his jaw set, his fingers moving in small, precise counts. He looked ancient and young at the same time, like someone who had been rebuilt again and again by necessity. From that shadowed spot behind the dumpster, I saw things in my father I'd never seen before. The way he tuned his breathing to the city's rhythm, the way his shoulders hunched to make himself smaller, the way he scanned every reflection and windshield as though they might betray an angle of attack. He spoke little, just one-sentence checks. "No tails yet. 3 cars on the corner. We move in 10. Each phrase landed like a stone in my head. He was methodical, not panicked. The man who sold insurance appeared to have been packed away for good, replaced by someone who'd lived 100 lives. Watching him was like watching a video of someone I thought I knew. The footage was familiar, but the person moved differently. Minutes felt like hours, and then I spotted my mother's Civic limping into the lane. She looked like she belonged to a different movie when she climbed out. Her hair was scraped into a tight knot, her jacket zipped up to her neck. Her hands were steady on the wheel when she killed the engine. She walked over with a duffel at her side and a look I couldn't read at first. The woman who smiled at recitals and reminded me to practice was gone for that moment. She moved with the surety of someone who could aim a handgun and then drive a car onto 2 tires without flinching. "Get in," she said, without emotion, like the word itself had weight and finality. That single sentence made me obey. In the car, she changed more. She swapped a sweater for a black hoodie, twisted a cap on backward, and tucked a bandana into the pocket like a patch for wounds. I watched her fingers tighten around the steering wheel as if checking its shape, like a mechanic checks the fit of a wrench. She drove with a brutality I hadn't seen before, cutting lanes, ignoring traffic lights, moving with a certainty that carved a path through risk. When a pickup truck tried to box us in, she jerked the wheel, slid the bumper, and pulled through without a scrape. "They'll look for the smart move," she said, "so we do the stupid one. Less expected." Her voice had an edge that made me straighten in my seat. She was all focus now, all muscle and calculation, a woman who'd kept herself ready for a life I never knew we were living. We rode away in the Civic that felt both like salvation and exile. The city blurred, lights smeared into streaks. My father sat in the passenger seat with his hands folded and watched the mirrors like a hawk. I sat in the back, passport heavy in my pocket, and tried to fold this night into something I could understand. My mother hummed a tune under her breath, a small sound like an anchor. It was the only soft thing in a night that had none. We were together and moving, and that was enough to keep me from falling apart completely. We met Marshal Service Agent Nora Lee at the library like someone who steps into a wrong movie and finds the stage crew waiting. Nora Lee, Marshal Service Agent, didn't smile. She told us flat that Tyson had been executed 3 hours earlier, and she didn't waste time on sympathy. They had the time they needed, she said. A production leak showed up in the wrong places. Faces they should have blurred were left clear. That gave them everything: roots, houses, names. Her voice was calm, but it cut through me like cold water. I remember saying nothing because I couldn't figure out where to put the shock. My dad stood with his back straight, watching her like a man at a trial. "We need your weapon," Nora said, and she didn't ask nicely. My father's jaw tightened and he held the pistol like a habit. He didn't want to give it up, not after the night we'd had. He argued, quietly at first, about how they might need it for protection. Nora was blunt. "Not here. You're under federal protection. We control the force." I could see the names of his past flash across his face, years of making choices in dark rooms, and I knew he wouldn't give it freely. I stepped forward and said, "You need help. Federal resources are our only shot. Hand it over." My voice shook, but it was enough to tilt him. He looked at me like I'd grown older in one sentence and then reached into his coat and handed the gun to her. He didn't put up much of a fight after that. Nora took the weapon and tucked it into a bag as if it were evidence in a case she'd been waiting to build. She gave us strict instructions, clear and immovable. Go to the motel she named, wait, do not use phones, do not contact anyone, and do not leave without a marshal with you. The rules landed on us like a new set of bones we had to live inside. The motel smelled like a hospital: bleach, stale coffee, disinfectant. The windows were barred and the light in the parking lot hummed like an unblinking eye. Nora placed us in a single grim room where the bedspread scratched and the curtains were thin enough to let the street light draw lines on the floor. She told us the place would be guarded and monitored. "You will sleep. I will sleep. We don't take chances," she said. There was a tired steel in her tone I didn't like but depended on. She warned us again about phones and said the marshals would review any requests. We signed forms and handed over small things that felt like pieces of our past lives. Someone from the marshals took the burner phone and the keys and the passport. It felt like losing a limb. My mother folded her hands and watched Nora leave, eyes blank with exhaustion she didn't have time to feel. That night, lying on the scratchy bedspread, the motel's one reading lamp lit half my face and threw the rest into shadow. I listened to my parents argue in low voices so I wouldn't wake Nora. They picked apart every choice they'd made with the coldness of people who had rehearsed this story too many times. My father said things about deals and bargains, how people in suits made promises he couldn't keep forever. My mother spoke about handlers and safe houses, about how they called people in lives were moved like chess pieces. I demanded truth. I told them I wanted honesty from now on. "No more secrets," I said. "I deserve to hear everything." They both went quiet, and my father put his hand on mine like an apology without words. "We should have told you," he said. "We were protecting you the only way we knew how." My mother nodded and said, "From now on, no more hidden rooms. We tell you everything." It felt fragile, like a promise made on borrowed time, but I held on to it like a life raft. I tried to sleep and mostly failed. The room hummed and my breath sounded too loud. Around midnight, Nora knocked softly on the door and her face was a line of bad news. She sat on the edge of the bed and opened one of our duffels with gloved hands. She pulled out socks, a paperback, and then a little square of plastic sewn into the seam. She held it up under the lamp. "GPS tracker," she said. "Someone has been pinning your locations for months." The words landed heavier than I expected. My stomach dropped like a stone. We had been tracked the whole time, not just now. The duffel we thought was a kit was a beacon. The idea that every safe house, every motel, every route might have been disclosed felt like a knife. Nora's face didn't change much, but it was sharper now, like someone who just found a missing page to a dangerous book. We fled with only the clothes on our backs and the emergency cash stuffed in a sock. Nora moved fast, efficient, and without spectacle. She handed me a thin jacket and a map of the city with a route she trusted. "No phones, no social contact, and follow me," she said. My mother grabbed what she could, tossing in a small Bible and a photograph that had somehow not met fire. My father took one of the duffels, and we left the room like something abandoned. The cold air hit like reality. We walked to the car in a tight line, each of us shadowed and alert. The motel's neon sign flickered behind us as we drove away. I watched the light grow small in the rearview and thought about the life I thought I'd had. We had traded a bedspread for a car seat and some cash, and we were moving again with a new name on my tongue and a new kind of fear stitched into our steps. Nora put me behind the wheel on a back road and told me to forget everything I thought I knew about driving, which made me laugh once, a short, scared sound. She coached me like a drill sergeant. "Brake here, countersteer there, don't stare at the ditch." I gripped the wheel until my knuckles hurt and tried to breathe like she told me. For a few hours, I drove like I was following a script, hard turns and quick reversals that made my stomach flip. Nora sat beside me and watched my hands, steady and calm, correcting my posture and muttering small tips that somehow cut the panic out of my throat. It felt like school for an emergency I'd never signed up for, but it worked. My hands learned to move without my brain catching up, and I started to trust the car under me. Then one night we hit gravel on a tight corner and everything went wrong in a single, terrible breath. There was a bang like someone slamming a door, the car lurched, and we slid sideways. The world condensed into a series of sounds: metal, a tire screaming, and my own blood roaring in my ears. We rolled, not far, but hard enough that the side of the road swallowed us. The Civic slammed into a shallow ditch with a thud that shook my teeth. For a moment everything was silence, and the air smelled like dust and spilled coffee. My mother hit her head against the window and blood ran into her hair. She was conscious, but dazed and kept asking in a small voice if the children were okay, like some old habit of asking first. Nora checked her fast, hands moving in the way of people who have done this before. "Stay with me, look at me," she said, and her voice was a hard thread pulling us back. We bandaged her with what we had: a scarf, some torn shirt, sterile wipes from a first aid kit Nora kept in the glove box. The bandage felt clumsy and tight, but it held the blood and stopped the worst. My mother blinked and laughed once, sharp, because she hated being helpless. "Stupid ditch," she said, half a joke, half a prayer. Nora called for backup on a secure line and described our location in clear, short bursts: ditch, minor injuries, need a tow, and a medic. She stayed with us while we waited, pacing the small space around the wreck like a captain on deck. The officers who arrived were efficient and quick, checking vitals and helping us out of the car like we were something fragile and important. We were bruised and shaken, but alive. The crash left us quieter, the kind of quiet that sits in your bones and rearranges your ideas about luck. After the tow, sitting in the back of a patrol car with a cup of bad coffee, Nora explained the legal side that felt like a different kind of danger. She told us my dad's original protection deal had lapsed years ago because the prosecutors assumed the syndicate was broken. "Deals have limits," Nora said flatly. "They expire. New threats mean new negotiations." She laid out the choice plainly. If my father cooperated fully again, testify, give names, hand over evidence, the marshals and prosecutors could get a new arrangement for our family. It wouldn't be free. He would likely face legal consequences for past crimes, maybe even prison time. His eyes hardened when she said it, like a man measuring the weight of his own life. I watched him for a long time before he spoke. "I'll do it," he said quietly. "Whatever it takes to keep them safe." His voice was small and enormous at once, carrying a tiredness that made me feel older and steadier than I had a minute before. In the days that followed, arrests and seizures happened in fits and starts. Local cops and federal agents moved like a machine set into motion. They took cars, phones, and weapons and hauled away men who looked like bad decisions in human form. For a while, the world felt like it had teeth again, snapping shut around people who had chased us. But Alex Yates, the leader we were told to hate, stayed ahead of the net. "He's off-grid," Nora said once, showing me a board with holes where names and locations used to be. "He knows how to vanish." It gnawed at me that the person behind everything was still a ghost. Then they brought a laptop into a room with bright lights and a slow, careful energy. The tech sifted through files and found a trail I almost couldn't look at. Months of surveillance, screenshots of my social posts, pictures of my friends, and printed maps with our house circled in heavy marker. There were photos of our home after the fire, images of the burned and cordoned-off porch we'd stared at through a TV screen, and videos taken from angles I'd thought private. I watched them on an encrypted feed, my throat tightening as I recognized our yard, our tree, things only someone watching closely would have. The screen showed our life in a dozen cold frames, and I felt erased, like my old existence had been replaced by files on a hard drive. Watching that evidence made the danger real in a way no shouting ever had. It wasn't just people who wanted to scare us. It was organized, patient watching. Someone had been building a file on us for months, waiting for a moment to strike. That thought sat heavy in my chest as we moved from one safe place to another, each stop a temporary pause, and I learned to sleep sitting up, alert to the world like a bird that never really relaxes. Nora paced me through the plan like a conductor. She said, "We need something big enough to draw him," and I could hear the rest of the marshals nodding in the background. They chose my father to be bait because he was the thread that tied the syndicate to names and places. They set it at a busy bus depot where people came and went, and Nora insisted on sealed exits, undercover officers in every line of sight, and audio wired to my dad's bench. He sat there like a man waiting for a verdict, his coat buttoned, a wire taped under the collar, and his hands folded like he was holding himself together out of habit. The morning smelled like diesel and old coffee, and the depot hummed with early commuters who had no idea what was about to happen. My stomach felt like someone had tied a knot in it and left it there. Nora put me behind a glass partition with other agents and said, "You watch, but don't make a sound." I watched my father through the window, each breath visible in the cold air. He tried to look like any other commuter, a newspaper folded in his lap, the casual tilt you see on benches. But I could see how his fingers trembled when he folded the paper. He caught my eye once and mouthed, "Okay," and I nodded because there was nothing else to do but trust. They tightened the perimeter until it felt like we were in a cage built of men and radios. Agents in plain clothes stood with their hands near holsters and eyes tuned to small movements. Nora whispered over a collar mic, "Positions check. Every exit sealed. Cameras on the roof. Wait for the signal." The plan was surgical in its simplicity. Let the mob come for him in public, overwhelm them with force, and use the chaos to cut off escape. It was bold and dangerous in the same breath, but it was the only shot we had at drawing Yates into daylight. Then the moment came like a cut in a play. A man approached with a gait that didn't belong to the morning rush. He walked with purpose and a face that looked like someone who had practiced walking 1,000 times. He stopped in front of my father, leaned in like he wanted a private word, and then Yates, the name everyone whispered in the meetings, pulled a gun. The morning broke into a different sound, metal, shouted commands, and the pounding of feet. Gun. Someone yelled, and the officers moved like a wall collapsing, and then reforming around the danger. Everything happened fast and loud. Officers swarmed the man who had drawn the gun. Two others stepped out from behind columns and tried to run, but plainclothes units closed on them in sharp, practiced moves. Handcuffs clicked. I remember thinking the way the world narrowed to the clink of metal and the flash of badges. Then a shot rang out, a sharp report, and someone yelled that a policeman was hit. I could see the uniformed officer stumble and drop to the floor. And for a terrifying second, no, one moved because the rules of the operation had broken into real blood and not a drill. My father stayed where he was, wired and recording, breathing hard but alive, his face gray as if the color had been squeezed out of it. "Keep him down," Nora shouted into the mic. Agents wrapped cuffs around the accomplices and hauled them into the depot's lobby. One went silent under a sweep of someone's knee, another spat curses, eyes wild. The injured policeman was dragged behind cover, and medics rushed in with a bag that smelled like antiseptic and fear. I watched the scene unfold like a film I couldn't turn off. But Alex Yates, mob leader, did something I didn't expect. In the chaos and the noise, he found a maintenance corridor and vanished like smoke. 1 second he was there, a dark coat, a glare that could stop conversation. The next he was a shadow swallowed by a service door. The corridor map later showed how he ducked through a hatch and crawled past a service ladder into a place where cameras didn't watch. He escaped while the officers were busy securing the other exits, and that fact sat between all of us like a cold stone. Afterward, my father was taken into federal custody. They moved him not as a prisoner alone, but as someone fragile and valuable, both a shield and a key. Nora told me, "We're protecting him and we need his cooperation." They drove him away in a van that smelled like vinyl and policy, and I rode with them to a facility where questions would be asked and answers recorded. The officers cuffed him gently for transport and told me to stay put until they cleared the perimeter. I felt like the center of a storm, watching the person who had been my whole life walk to a place that smelled of interrogation. The arrests that followed were heavy with consequence. With 2 accomplices in custody and phones and records seized, forensic teams began to build a case. They found call logs, intercepted messages, and numbers that tied arrested men to higher-ups. Prosecutors said the evidence would lead to plea deals and testimony that could widen the net and bring more people in. "They'll flip," one prosecutor told us, meaning men who answered to Yates might talk to save themselves. Still, the fact that Yates remained off-grid haunted us. He was the head of the machine that had tried to burn our lives, and he was still free to move in the darkness. The sting had taken a small victory: arrests, wounded law enforcement, and a map of how the syndicate operated. But it had also shown the limits of what we could do. We had pushed back, but the leader still escaped, and that empty space where he should have been felt as dangerous as a loaded gun. Nora looked at me once after everything settled. "We'll get him," she said, but her voice held the tiredness of someone who had chased shadows before. I wanted to believe her with everything in me, because after that day, our life was no longer something that happened to us quietly. It was a fight, every step planned and paid for in fear. Nora walked us from the motel to a locked building like someone shepherding cats through a storm. She had the calm you get from doing dangerous work every day. "This is temporary," she said, and I wanted to argue, but there was no arguing that night. The facility smelled clean and official, and the rules were the same. No phones, no visitors, no leaving. We slept on narrow cots in a room with metal lockers while agents rotated through the hall outside. It felt like being suspended between lives, not belonging to either. I watched my parents pack and unpack the way people check a map when they don't know which road is safe anymore. After a week that folded into itself, Nora moved us into a bland apartment that the marshals paid for. It had a couch that sagged and blinds that didn't close all the way, but it also had locks that made my skin feel safer. The place was gray in a way that stopped expectations. There were no pictures on the walls, no furniture that said anything about us. For the first time, I saw my mother as a woman who had chosen to hide pieces of herself. She sat me down on that couch and said, "I need to tell you something I never wanted you to have to know." She told me she had worked in private security overseas before we entered relocation, trained in combat, surveillance, and high-risk extraction. She said she downplayed everything to give me a childhood that looked normal. Her hands did not shake when she said it, but her voice carried years of restraint. I taught piano because it was safe to teach, she said. Not because I wanted to stop being useful. I didn't want you to grow up loving danger. Hearing it made me both angry and relieved, like a puzzle piece that had been hidden in plain sight. We promised you no more lies, my dad said, sitting across from us with his elbows on his knees. He looked tired in a new way, older and honest. He'd spent years keeping clean stories for neighbors and teachers, and now he laid out parts of his story he hadn't before. The names he'd given, the deals he'd cut, the people he'd helped put away, and those who still wanted revenge. He didn't give me every detail, but the silence between sentences held more truth than the life I'd been fed. We did it so you would be safe, he said, and we were not careful enough. That sentence felt like a wound and an apology bound together. A tech specialist from the Marshals came to the apartment and set up a small war room in the living room. He introduced himself with a badge and a stack of laptops, and then he began erasing my old life. "We'll scrub everything," he said simply. He showed me how cached pages worked, why tagged photos could follow you, and how metadata lived inside every image. They closed accounts, wiped caches, and pulled down posts. My Instagram persona, Lee Lane, disappeared like a name scratched off a mailbox. The feed that had felt like my voice vanished, and with it went the small comfort of likes and comments that had anchored me. Watching it go felt like losing a diary and a fake identity at the same time. The specialist explained that they'd replace traces with benign noise, old comments, fake accounts, layers of digital static that would hide us in the system. It was strange letting people I didn't know delete my life publicly, and oddly relieving. The Marshals began the paperwork for new identities in slow, careful steps. Forms were filled, background checks amended, and names were chosen with the clinical care of a hospital list. There were legal meetings, signatures, and photographs taken in fluorescent light that made my face look like someone's evidence. I tried on the idea of a new name in my head like clothes, seeing which fit. It felt wrong and right at the same time. One morning, Nora knocked on the door and used that new name. "Madison," she said, and it landed like a legal stamp. It was the first time anyone in authority had called me that, and I felt a rush of something hard to name, grief, yes, but also a tiny strip of resolve. The name made part of me real in a way the old nickname never had. There were hard talks about consequences. Nora explained that my father's cooperation could get real legal weight behind rebuilding our protection. It might also mean legal costs for him. We all sat with that and decided that safety came first. My parents agreed to be open with me, and each small confession made our small apartment feel less like a waiting room for disaster and more like home, though an altered one. We ate boxed cereal and reheated soup more than we'd like to admit, but we talked more honestly than we had in years. We planned small steps forward. Therapy when the Marshals allowed it, classes for me under my new name, and a list of things we could say out loud now. In the evenings, I would sit by the window and look at the dull streetlight, thinking about the life that had been ripped into files and the one being stitched back together. We still had each other. We had Nora and the Marshals, a legal promise, and a new name that wasn't just ink on a page. It didn't feel like a victory. It felt like the first breath after a long submersion. I didn't know what would come next, but I felt a sliver of resolve that maybe, step by step, we could make something honest out of the ashes. Federal investigations kept moving like a slow machine that chewed up papers and spit out names. Detectives, marshals, and tech teams worked in rooms full of maps and printouts, and I watched as they unspooled the syndicate's logistics piece by piece. They traced money flows, phone chains, and rental cars. Each arrest felt like a puzzle piece snapping into place. I sat in briefings behind a glass window and listened to officers explain how they'd linked seized phones to handlers and how surveillance photos matched license plates. The work was boring in a legal way and violent in consequence, but it was work that made the danger tangible and organized. Nora set up monitored calls with my dad in federal custody, and those talks became a new, awkward rhythm for us. He'd clear his throat and say my name, Madison, and then begin with apologies. "I should have told you sooner," he said one morning, voice rough. I thought ignorance protected you, but I was wrong. I asked questions, and he answered without the evasions that had lived in our quiet house for years. He explained how deals were made and why he'd thought distance and silence were safety. I told him about the things I'd lost. Friends who didn't really know me, a feed of images that had vanished, and the childhood I'd trusted as real. He listened and promised to rebuild trust honestly. I will tell you everything I can, he said, and even though that promise was fragile, it was the first straight line we'd had in a long time. Detectives kept digging and made a stack of arrest reports that grew like a bad weather map. Men who had followed orders for years began to get calls from lawyers and prosecutors, and the pressure made some of them talk. We watched as plea offers were discussed in closed rooms and as evidence from seized laptops and phones tied people to crimes. The marshals and local police worked together to build case files with pictures, bank transfers, and intercepted messages. These files started to feel like a net tightening around the syndicate's middle managers. It wasn't quick justice. It was methodical and slow, and every small win required paperwork and witness statements. Still, each person taken into custody meant one more link broken. The marshals pressed the production company that had aired raw footage and caused the leak. Nora demanded answers and better safeguards. The producer, a man with a habit of talking too fast, promised to change procedures. We made a mistake, he said in a meeting with Nora and her team. Blurs were missed and we exposed people. We'll tighten checks. We'll cooperate fully. I watched him sign forms and nod, and though I wanted to hate him, I also wanted to believe his words because action felt better than blame. The company agreed to new protocols, stricter editing steps, double blur verification, and an internal audit trail so no single person could leak raw files again. It was a small fix to a large problem, but it mattered. With most attackers detained and the production company under oversight, the marshals began the formal relocation process for us. Nora sat us down with forms and timelines and walked through them like a teacher. She explained that relocation meant new names, a new town, and strict rules at first, but also a chance to rebuild without the noise of our old life. The paperwork was slow and thorough. I signed forms and watched as old records were closed and new ones prepared. My parents sat beside me, and sometimes we'd cry in private, the kind of tears that come when something you loved is changing for safety rather than choice. Nora promised that the marshals would secure the move, coordinate housing, and arrange for identity documentation that would make our past hard to find. There were still holes in the plan. Alex Yates remained off-grid and a threat on the board. Prosecutors believed that with the plea deals and the witnesses flipping, they could build more pressure and force him out. He can't hide forever, one prosecutor told me in a tone that was half reassurance and half factual stake in the ground. It didn't erase the fact that we lived with the knowledge of someone out there who had wanted us dead. But the arrests, the seized evidence, and the production company's change in practice felt like tools we could use to keep fighting. The day they handed us new paperwork felt like standing at a train station with a ticket to somewhere unknown. I held the new ID and saw my name printed there, Madison Carter, and I thought about the life that was ending and the life that might begin. We packed what we could carry, and Nora drove us to the moving van with agents who watched every corner. The future was a thin line, full of unknowns, but we were together and alive. That fragile survival felt like the first real step toward reclaiming who I was. I didn't know whether I would ever feel normal again. I only knew that we had truth now, and that truth, even heavy and painful, was a place to build from.
Thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video. And drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts.